again a leader in our educational system, understanding that knowledge must rest firmly on the foundation of truth. By establishing this commission, I know it was his vision that Virginia will continue that legacy of pioneering new ways of seeing things and laying a path moving forward that we all can be proud of. I'm also grateful to Secretary Carney and his entire team who've been in such support of this initiative and have shown the passion worthy of this topic. I also want to thank the subcommittee members who invested countless hours into this. Their passion and their professionalism was seen clearly through everything that they did. And I'd like to begin the report with just a preamble to what I included in our section of the report. And that had to do with the standards. You know, Virginia developed standards 25 years ago and really was a pioneer in developing these standards in the country. But the standards were tainted with a master narrative that marginalized or erased the presence of non-Europeans from the American landscape. These historical silences skew our perspective of the past. It erases people of color, and it supplants our nation with a false narrative that ignores the cultural underpinnings in American society. And so with that, I want to really highlight what the subcommittee, the Standards Subcommittee, had to do. We had three major objectives, and those included making recommendations for technical edits, identifying how those standards can be organized and improved, and providing that will also provide a more comprehensive picture of the American story, but also make recommendations on how Virginia can improve the standards revision process itself. Now, the Standards Subcommittee, as you can see, had an expansive charge, and it required three separate work groups within our subcommittee. But the entire subcommittee commented on every single report. So that is why I am honored to have been a part of this particular subcommittee. They invested countless hours over looking at every single standard of learning and then coming up with a recommendation for the process of revising those standards and reviewing the technical edits. They recommended changing the way history and social science courses would order that knowledge, looking at a thematic approach to teaching so that students can more easily understand these connections, see the connections of history so that they become part of how they relate what is currently going on with what went on in the past. And finally, in making sure that the students had a deeper understanding and comprehension of how African Americans were part of the American landscape from really the beginning, even though the Jamestown colony, or settlement, I should say, was established in 1607, it really was not until 1619 that the colony would survive with the establishment of a governmental system, with the expansion of its economy based on tobacco production, but with the introduction of Africans into the American landscape, it changed even the way in which people understood concepts of freedom. And so the first work group that we had was the Technical Edits Work Group. It reviewed every standard in U.S. history and the social sciences to ensure that the content was correct. And the committee really struggled with trying to make sure that every word had the correct meaning that was needed for that particular standard. And Dr. Ed Ayers chaired this particular work group. And I would like to invite him now to come and talk a little bit about, or give a summary of what the technical edit work group did. Dr.
It's great to see everyone, and welcome Governor Northam. Now, in my last comments to the commission, which have been described pretty thoroughly in press coverage, I gave examples of ways that our work on the technical edits address the areas of inaccurate and incomplete portrayal of American history, making the curriculum frameworks more complete, more concrete, more balanced, and more active. We propose, for example, replacing the passive explanation for the appearance of African people in Virginia with a broader Atlantic perspective that explains why and how that happened. We propose changing the vague and circular language about cultural, economic, and constitutional differences between the North and the South, eventually causing the Civil War, to acknowledge that all of those differences grew out of slavery. We propose adding lynching and disfranchisement, which are now conspicuously absent in the frameworks. We also propose adding Black inventors and labor leaders, the Great Migration, the Harlem Renaissance, and the invention of jazz, for modern America is incomprehensible without them. These changes and additions allow us to see more clearly the roles of millions of people over 400 years in the building, defense, and long-delayed and still incomplete progress of our nation. If this part of the commission did nothing else, that work would be important, and we're grateful for the opportunity. But this work has even larger consequences. For to think about the place of African Americans in American life is to make all American history more comprehensible, more honest, and more accurate. It is to make that history more sobering, but also more inspiring. Reconsidering what we teach our children about the role of Black people in our history leads us, first of all, to think about other people who've been left out of our stories. Native Virginians and Native Americans in particular have been pushed aside. The viral growth of what began in Virginia into the largest system of slavery in the world, beginning here in the 17th century and spreading for more than 2 centuries, came with the repeated dispossession of American Indians from land on which they had lived for millennia. Those peoples have found ways to maintain their identity in their communities, even over centuries, in the face of efforts to erase them from history. The curricular revisions also lead us to think about the newest Virginians and how we integrate their many histories from around the world into that of our state. We need to lift our eyes to broader patterns in the United States and around the world. Thinking about the history of Black Americans reminds us of the importance of rights, of laws, of courts, of nonviolent protest, and of voting for all Americans. Reconsidering African American history, finally, leads us to think about what and how we tell our children about the continuing weight of our history. It requires knowledge and care to talk about centuries of enslavement, about the invention and perpetuation of the mythology of so-called race, about the violence that held slavery and segregation in place, about the consequences of generations of wealth denied to those who created it, about continuing inequities in housing, schools, health, and criminal justice. Students know these aspects of history happen, for they can see the effects with their own eyes. If they don't learn in school about the origins of those powerful forces, they will assume correctly that we're not teaching them an honest history. We cannot afford that loss of faith in our schools and in our society. Teachers need to be equipped and empowered to talk honestly with their students about these truths of history. But teachers alone cannot bear all of this burden. They must have the support of their school leaders, their divisions, and their state policymakers. They must have the support of parents and their community. They must have the collaboration of higher education. And they must be able to take advantage of the remarkable museums and sites in Virginia that are working to tell a more complete and honest story. Most of all, our teachers must be acknowledged and rewarded for teaching the truth, essential work for everyone in all our communities. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ayers. And may I add that we must make sure, and part of the recommendation of the Standards Subcommittee is to make sure that starting with kindergarten, that the children are taught their history, that we cannot continue to allow these young people to learn history later on in their lives. They must be inculcated with that history from the beginning as soon as they move forward, and to understand then how our standards should be reordered and how we can make those connections between the past and the present. The subcommittee looked at 10 key concepts, and we defined each of those concepts so that as the narrative is moving forward, students can understand what freedom really means and what freedom meant from the beginning, starting in 1607, beginning or continuing in 1619, and then continuing through our period of enslavement, segregation, and oppression. Because the majority of the people who arrived in the Virginia colony were actually unfree. And most of the narratives only focus attention on people of African descent as being unfree. So we must understand the definition of freedom. We must understand what imperialism, nationalism, colonialism is all about. These are key concepts in our history and in our society and culture. We must understand what racism is. Racism is not a personal decision that people make. It is part of a system. It is part of a legal, a cultural, an economic, a political, a social system. And so having young people understand what that definition is really key to understanding American history. They must understand what capitalism is and what economic motivation is all about. They must understand what citizenship means, that it is not just being patriotic, but it is also understanding the responsibilities that are part of citizenship that goes also along with maintaining a democratic society. Servitude and enslavement and the differences between those two concepts that often have been muddled in our standards. Advocacy and agency, because people are not just oppressed, but they take agency. They are the ones who have pushed the boundaries, and we would see people of African descent pushing the boundaries as those who wanted to enslave them were met with resistance and with a fight, both legal, political, social, as well as active. Then there's cultural expressionism that helps to define America in a way that no country on this planet can see. In fact, America is the leader in so many ways of cultural expressionism. And then finally, this invasion and colonization that so detrimentally impacted the Native peoples in our country, but also people around the world. So the Standards Overhaul Group recommended the revision or elimination of standards that were inaccurate and out of date, and securing funds for professional development to equip educators to teach these new standards. And of course, many on the committee offered their professional assistance to help with that. In addition to this, the work of the Department of Education is key. And at this point, I would like to invite Dr. Christine Harris and Ms. Christonia Brown to provide us with an overview of the work of the Process Revision Work Group that implements how the standards can be revised.
Thank you. Good morning, Governor Northam and Commission members. The Process Revision Work Group began by reviewing the Code of Virginia, specifically the standards of quality, and highlighted the procedures for the review of the standards of learning. We began by looking at the role of the Board of Education, the Department of Education, opportunities for public hearings, and then the submission process for recommendations to improve the standards. The work group examined the actions of the department beyond the code to review and revise the 2015 History and Social Science Standards of Learning. These additional actions included developing standards for teams of educators from across the Commonwealth, hosting multiple public hearings in historic locations, and meeting with content experts that included partners from universities, museums, and historians. While there were strengths in the process, the consensus from the work group was that more intentional connections were needed. Therefore, the work group has made recommendations that increase public outreach, enrich collaboration, and expand opportunities for content experts to give input so that we can teach a more inclusive and comprehensive history. Appendix E has the full details, and at this time, Christania Brown will go into more depths about the recommendations. And as the history coordinator for the Commonwealth, she will talk about the process that she'll begin later in 2021.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you, Governor Northam, for the opportunity to look at our standards for history and social science, and then also the process that we take to carry out the review and revision of the standards. It has been truly an honor to work with so many historians from across the Commonwealth. So following Dr. Ed Ayers and Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander, I am in awe of their time that they have dedicated to this subcommittee. As Christine noted, the last time that we reviewed and revised the standards, we did extend the process. But as this commission has been working, the work group felt that we needed to go a little further. And I am truly grateful for their recommendations. So I'm not going to read all of them to you, but what I do want to point out in this process that we would like to, the work group is recommending that that the committees are expanded, that we include more teachers, more historians, and more external groups, that we convene a steering committee comprising of those content experts before we even take the document to the subcommittees to review. Look at that starting place. Where can we expand? Where can we get rid of those outdated standards? Where can we definitely change the inaccuracy that we have in our standards and our curriculum framework? We also really want to concentrate on ensuring that all comments, perspectives, events are thoroughly vetted to determine the next steps, just in case there are some inaccuracies. How can we go back and put a process in place to make those corrections? Not only are we extending the opportunities for more people to be involved, we definitely want to make sure that the voices across the Commonwealth are included. That includes students, parents, administrators, and other educators as well. So we would like to look at the recommendations from the historians and then also our communities. But all of this is very, very, very necessary that we secure funds for expanding the educator and external committees. So, Dr. Newby-Alexander, I will turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much. And as a quick conclusion, these are the general recommendations of our subcommittee that the State Superintendent of Public Education, Dr. Lane, approved the technical edits, and that the Board of Education revise the standards review process and consider our 10 concepts as a beginning point as those standards are being revised. And finally, requiring that history be included in a mandated way for all levels, K through 12, to ensure that our entire citizenry in Virginia is educated about the history of Virginia as well as the nation. Thank you so much.